Welcome to what in some calendars, in terms of our reading anyway, today is Ordinary Sunday 9. For those who wish to have readings from the Te Pouhere, we have done it these previous years, so if you go back through the files, you'll find our recordings on Te Pouhere Sunday. Welcome to Damon in Wanaka, to John in Auckland, to Deborah in Hawke's Bay. I'm coming to you, if it looks a little strange in the background, from a quaint little B&B in Mount Victoria, Wellington. Nice to have the three of you on board, and Damon, some background on a quite visual sort of a passage from Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's good to be back with Mark. I have to say it's been some time since we've had our readings from Ordinary Time. I think the last time was in early February. So it's pleasing to get back to Mark. Not that I disliked John, but there's an earthiness about Mark that I particularly enjoy. And so I suppose that's the first comment I want to make. We are back in the readings for the year of Mark, through working our way through Mark's Gospel. But the second point I just really want to make is that our reading today, which is Mark chapter 2 and into chapter 3, is set within a section of Mark's Gospel, which is part of Jesus's preaching and teaching and healing ministry in Galilee. And in particular, it forms, these two stories form two conflict stories that are clustered together, two of five conflict stories that are clustered together early on in Mark's Gospel. And it's very likely that they were used and put together in this position for the purposes of offering some guidance to church members of that time. And those two stories, one of them is around, of course, the plucking heads of grain, and the second is the healing a man with withered hand. Jesus's popularity is on the rise. And at the same time, we see that he's also coming to the attention of the religious leaders. So there's an increasing hostility, which certainly comes to the fore in both of these readings today. And the question really is being asked is, what is lawful on the Sabbath? And the two stories give two examples: the disciples and the grain field plucking heads of grain. And the second, as I said, it's the healing of a man with a withered hand. Both of those situations, there were provisions to allow them in the law, but the interpretation of the religious leaders of the day seemed to have a very different position. And Jesus's response, as we'll go on to say, is very much to say that the Sabbath was made for humankind and not the other way round. And the last comment I suppose I just want to really make is the difference between or the contrast between Jesus and the religious leaders. Especially towards the end, we see this in his increasing anger at the situation that he sees, and there's silence, and then his action, an action for good. And in contrast, it's their conspiring to destroy. So just a few comments in passing.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. Either Jesus or Mark or both beginning to build up right from the beginning, in a sense, towards a conflict and a climax. So let's see what we find challenging when we encounter this. Deborah.
Well, for me, the challenge comes from the first of those two stories, the story about kind of plucking heads of grain, because Jesus says, "Have you never read what David did when his companions were hungry and in need of food, entering the house of God when Abiathar was high priest?" Now, many commentators point out that this is wrong in all respects. The high priest wasn't Abiathar, it was Ahimelech. David was alone, not with companions with him, and hunger wasn't mentioned. So is it Mark who gets it wrong, or is it Jesus getting it wrong? And several commentators say, well, possibly the idea that Jesus does it on purpose, because to see if the Pharisees will spot it. And they don't, because maybe they don't know their scriptures as well as they think they do. And that's the challenge, I think, for me. How well do we know our scriptures? And when we debate, how well do we know the original context and how that applies? Or are we just throwing verses at one another? So yeah, how well do we know our scriptures is the challenge for me.
Indeed, thank you for that, because that's a real challenge, and those text wars are very ugly, and our lack of knowledge, well, speaking for me, is sometimes self-incriminatory. John, for you, what do you find challenging?
Well, I reckon the Pharisees and those people who were the religious leaders started off as good people, And what has changed them is they're kind of sticking to these little laws, which maybe have been good and valuable and maybe even life-giving ones, but they stick to them. And like we sometimes stick to some of our own things, like, there's a certain way of doing the communion. And if you get that wrong, you'll upset us all. And we make those little tight rules which can get in the way. And yeah, I think they were good people once, but now they're kind of clinging to these old traditions which don't have much life, in fact, have no life.
So underscoring their kind of a legalistic overload that we can all slip into. Yeah, thanks, Damon.
Yeah, I think a couple of things for me that picks up on what John has just said as well. There's an element to that. We all like the underdog in the story, the one who stands up against what is perceived as a corrupt or unjust system. And so in a story like this, we're cheering Jesus on in many respects as he's challenging the existing the status quo. And then all of a sudden you begin to realize, well, where are you and I in this story? Where is the church in the story? And actually, as John's just indicated, that Jesus is directing this challenge at us and our tendency to put rules and rituals before relationships. So that's, for me, is one challenge. And the other is slightly different, and that is the Sabbath is a good thing and it deserves protection. And I just think that it's one of the things that we really learnt during those early stages of COVID when we went into lockdown. For many people, not for all, but for many people, that forced rest was a real positive. And we also see it in terms of the impact and that it had for the natural world about us as well. The bird life where I am just increased, manyfold. And so the Sabbath is important and it needs protecting. And that's a challenge that comes for me out of the story too, which is
It is indeed, and some of us will remember, or I probably all remember, that sense that many Maori theologians picked up of Papatūānuku being given a chance to breathe again, and painful though COVID was, there was a lesson there. So let's talk then. If I can go to you, John, where do you begin to sort of find some good news here?
Well, I like the fact that Jesus blasts the way through the concrete of their barriers. He blasts resurrection life, and wherever he goes, there is life. The man with the withered arm, he gets his arm back on the Sabbath, and he gets his chance to work again. And like wherever Jesus goes, like the kingdom comes close and miracles happen despite the opposition against him. Yeah. So I like that.
Yeah, very much so. And having just come out of John with his contrasts of light and life and darkness and so on, Mark does this a different way, and he's putting it in our face there. So thank you, Damon. For you, let's unpack some good news.
I mean, over the last few weeks, we've been spending quite a bit of time in John's Gospel, and as I said previously, wonderful stuff. But it is quite heady stuff at times, deeply reflective. And here in this Gospel, we come upon a Jesus who seems to be a lot more earthy, doesn't say as much. But the one very powerful thing that comes through it all is that people matter, and that's incredibly good news. It's something that we need to be reminded of often. One of my favorite authors is Barbara Brown Taylor, an American Episcopalian priest, and she wrote a book called Leaving Church, and beautifully poetic book. But there's one bit where she talks about how her faith is more about relationships and doctrine, and that just really resonated with me. Because we sometimes put doctrine in this place that seems to just push down relationships, and yet actually I think the doctrines of the church, the teachings of the church, only truly make sense when we are in right relationship with each other. And I like that about what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that the Sabbath is wrong. He's not saying that the traditions of the Jewish leaders are wrong. He's just saying that they've got to be put into context, into perspective, and that it's people who matter.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. And forget that at our peril. Deborah, for you, the good news.
The good news, I think, is that God wants to heal us and God wants to satisfy our hunger, whether it's by the grains, growing in the fields, or taking the story at face value by the bread in the tabernacle. So it's about asking ourselves, well, what do we hunger for at the moment? And what has God provided to feed us? Which bits of us and which bits of our communities need healing? And how will God bring that about? It's interesting that the healing story on the Sabbath, when we gather together for worship, how do those communities need healing? And can healing come to them on the Sabbath, on the Sunday when we come to worship?
Indeed. A fairly powerful question. All right, Damon, for you, so what? What matters here?
Aha, te mea nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What's the greatest thing in the world? The people, the people, the people. And I think what this text really reminds us, it's never the wrong day to do good. It's never the wrong day to heal. It's never the wrong day to save and to restore life.
Indeed, thank you. Pithy and right to the point. It doesn't let us wriggle too much there. Deborah, for you, the application of the so what?
About Sabbath keeping and rest, and how it's not designed to be just rest in itself. Like I might spend all of Monday, which is my Sabbath, playing games on my iPad. No, it's supposed to be rest with God. And that's both the good news and the challenge and the takeaway. How are we keeping Sabbath? And it's important to stop work to remind ourselves that the world doesn't revolve around us. But how are we enjoying the Sabbath together with God? Because I think that's part of what it was meant to be.
A focused Sabbath, a disciplined Sabbath, all of that. John, for you, so what?
Oh, despite the forces of evil, if you like, even well-intentioned people who become not so great, despite the opposition, Mark has good news to announce. And we have to have good news to announce when, a lot of kids I know at school worried about will China invade, or will this bad thing happen? And we come from a position where we have good news to announce because we have with us on our side Jesus, who will overcome the forces that are arrayed against us. I'm not talking about geopolitical, really. Jesus questions the pretense and the hypocrisy, and then he overcomes them.
Thank you. And it is a stressy time, and so I think that does need to be said geopolitically and spiritually. So thank you, John. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Damon. And it's nice to be back with Mark, as Damon said. But here we are, breaking open the Mark and insights into the world.